After months of speculation, President Trump has fired Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Happened in this hour just yesterday. He immediately replaced him with Matthew Whitaker. Whitaker, now the acting AG, is officially in charge of the Russia investigation as of yesterday afternoon. And he's been pretty clear about how he feels about it. Before, he was AG Sessions' chief of staff in that office. He wrote in 2017 that the Mueller investigation has, quote, gone too far. He also referred to Mueller and his team as a lynch mob and floated a plan to slowly choke off funds to the special counsel's office, effectively killing the investigation. In fact, he explicitly articulated that plan on CNN.
I could see a scenario where Jeff Sessions is replaced with a recess appointment, and that Attorney General doesn't fire Bob Mueller, but he just reduces his budget so low that his investigation grinds to almost a halt.
So our big question is, what happens to the Mueller investigation under President Trump's acting Attorney General? Joining me now, NBC News Justice and National Security reporter Julia Ainsley and politics reporter for the Daily Beast, Betsy Woodruff. She's also an MSNBC contributor. Ladies, you have been following the special counsel investigation now for quite some time, reporting on the ins and outs of it. The question of what would happen if Sessions were to be fired has been floated a number of times. We now know that he has been fired. He's been replaced by a partisan, not replaced by the Deputy Attorney General, who is Rod Rosenstein. Julia, what's going to happen to Mueller's investigation? What does this mean for the investigation going forward?
Well, you're right to call him a partisan, Katie. I've spoken to a number of people today who say it's clear where his loyalties lie, and that's been apparent since he came into the position as chief of staff. They've really seen him as kind of the eyes and ears as the White House, as that's also been reported. And there are a number of things he could do now that would have a direct impact on this investigation. One, he will decide whether or not to make that report that Bob Mueller will eventually write public, whether or not you and I and the public get to see what those results are on obstruction, on collusion, all of these big questions Betsy and I have been trying to get to the bottom of for over a year now. He will have that decision in his hands. He could also decide whether or not to stand up to the White House or to Congress on whether or not to declassify certain documents. We've seen Rod Rosenstein do that in the past. It's not clear that Whitaker would have that same backbone. He also could cut Mueller's knees out from beneath him by curtailing resources. That could be funding. That could be not allowing him to go down a certain path in his investigating. That could be a more subtle way that might not always rise to the top, that could just slowly bring it to a halt. And I say bring it to a halt because those are the words that Whitaker used on CNN just before he came into the Justice Department. He has already outlined that strategy before, Katie.
Julia, how do the career employees of the DOJ feel about this?
Well, they've known for some time that if this did not go to Rod Rosenstein after the firing of Sessions, if he was not put in that acting position, which seemed unlikely, that could spell a number of problems for the Mueller investigation and really kind of sour the Justice Department, especially when they see that their boss, the president, is making that kind of decision. And really, it would have the appearance of an ethics conflict, Katie. We can get into what that means, but it is on Whitaker himself to go to those ethics consultants inside. He could go to those inside the DOJ. He could go to those at the Office of Government Ethics. He could get that opinion, but it's incumbent upon him to do that. And a number of people I've spoken to said he has no plans to do that and that he fully intends to take over the Mueller probe.
Okay, so there are questions about whether or not he can be independent, not only from what he has said in the past about this investigation, but the relationships that he has with those who are being investigated. Sam Clovis is somebody that's come up in the investigation. They became friends when they ran unsuccessfully for the GOP nomination for Iowa Senate in 2014. Given that, Betsy, what is that going to mean for, say he gets an opinion from somebody in the ethics department, in the ethics office, saying that you really shouldn't be a part of this? Are we going to find out their opinion on that, or could Whitaker bury that? And is there any recourse?
Those ethics opinions are not automatically made public. It's possible that someone in that office could potentially leak such an opinion if such an opinion is being put together. It's also possible that reporters could acquire any such opinion through a FOIA or Freedom of Information Act request. But an important thing to remember about the way that the Justice Department handles some of these really thorny, or some may argue not so complicated, ethical issues is that the ethics attorneys there don't have veto power over what the political leadership does vis-a-vis these investigations. So the ethics advisors in the Justice Department, who are career officials who've been there for, in some cases, for extraordinarily long periods of time, won't be able to order Whitaker to take a step back from supervising the Mueller probe. Even if these officials conclude that it would be unethical for him to do so, they won't be able to mandate that he take that advice.
Betsy, one other question, and I was asked this last night by a group of people, and I didn't have a good answer for them. We've noticed that whenever Mueller has had an indictment, what we've seen is Rod Rosenstein go to the podium at DOJ and announce the indictment and lay it out. If there is an indictment that Mueller has tomorrow, today, the next week, are we still going to see that same procedure happen?
It's certainly possible, but look, it's unlikely that Whitaker is going to want to present himself as the new face or defender of the Mueller probe.
Will we see those indictments regardless of that sort of display?
It's a good question, and honestly, we don't know the answer to that right now. It also is likely to depend on what kind of indictments the Mueller is interested in bringing. Were Mueller to bring an indictment of somebody who is considered a political ally of Trump, I would be a little bit surprised, to say the least, to see Whitaker present himself as sort of a defender and a vocal face of that indictment. However, were Mueller to indict foreign nationals, as he has multiple times over the course of the last year and change since he became special counsel, it's more likely that political leadership at Justice Department, including Whitaker, would be willing and able to come forward and sort of put on the formal press conference that the Justice Department sometimes does in the case of these really big indictments.
That's a great point, Katie. I was just going to say it goes beyond just a press conference of what Betsy brings up and what this person speaking to you brought up. It would go to court. I mean, this person, the role Whitaker is stepping into, has to be able to defend the actions of the special counsel in court. So what will happen when you have someone who is such a loyalist to this presidency in that position? It's going to be a really tricky one. So we're going to see that play out across the board.
And we're going to see how long he's in this position and whether or not this administration nominates somebody new with any sort of expediency. Then, of course, who that person is and whether the Senate confirms them. Remember, the Senate has just added GOP senators, so that's probably a likelier bet than it was before. But again, those are just unknown at the moment. Julia Ainsley and Betsy Woodruff, ladies, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.